Hello and welcome back to another episode of What Game Am I Judging Next and Why? Today I'll be riding the coattails of The Last of Us Part 2, and that's right, I'm gonna dive in. Nope, never mind, because I don't have The Last of Us Part 2, I only have The Last of Us Part 1. So I'm gonna just do a little revisit for that game and just dive right into that and talk a little bit about that 7 years later. This will be my 4th time that I've played through this game, and I still loved it just as much as the first. So before I begin, I want to mention a fun little story about how The Last of Us came into fruition. Initially, Neil Druckmann, the game director, decided he wanted to make a game called Mankind, in which you played as a man slaughtering a bunch of infected women. What the actual f***? It wasn't until creative people within the company told him that this was very misogynistic and the game would be forever changed because women and others felt this was a bad case of representation. So why am I bringing this up? It's because I want to stress the importance of diversity and representation within a game's development cycle, which is something I highlighted in this previous video. Nope, not that part. Nope, that's just the wrong video. Or getting actual directors, creative directors. Ah, yes, there it is, the right video. Thank you. These characters, cultures, and backgrounds so they can represent. But I digress. Let's jump into this. Okay, so maybe you've never actually heard or read anything on The Last of Us. You never played it. You don't even know what the f it is. And if you plan on wanting to dive in the near future at all, I advise you to do that before listening to me ramble, because I will be diving deep into spoilers and all things that occur within the game. So here's your final warning. After this, all will be spoiled. Alright, The Last of Us is a story about a man who loses his daughter very early on in the game. Okay, that's not actually what the game's about, but that does happen. In fact, at first you play as his daughter in the beginning after about 25 minutes of exposition and setting up the prelude to how the infection began. That's about the time that you start playing as Joel and you are now carrying your daughter who has injured her foot in a car accident, trying to run away from everything. And this is a big parallel because you're now running away from an infected and then you are met by a National Guardsman. He is tasked to shoot anyone on sight, and after Joel tries to convince the guardsman otherwise, he ends up shooting Joel's daughter and then nicking Joel. This is a pretty strong parallel to how we see the story end. Moving on, we are introduced yet again to Joel 20 some odd years later, and we eventually find the motivation to the story. There's a girl that must be transported out of the safe zone who was bitten but hasn't transformed after 2 weeks of exposure. So Joel reluctantly sets out on an adventure across the United States to find the Fireflies, who have the doctors and the means to help find a cure to this terrible, terrible disease. Okay, so that's the most bare bones and probably terrible explanation of the story, but originally I had planned to do a review for this game, and I even have my score system set up that I've kind of worked on for a bit. So the score system is as follows. For everything I like in the game, it gets 1 star. For everything I don't like, it gets -12. If there's something I really don't like, then it gets a little half. Had a script and whatnot, but I thought 7 years later, a review could be pretty stale and a little out of touch. So instead, I wanted to talk about a certain theme and the story a bit more in depth, if you catch my drift. So which theme did I want to zero in on? Because there are many in this game. Family is a big one, father-daughter relationship to be more specific, but the one I really wanted to talk about is grief. Grief is everywhere in this game. We are constantly grieving for characters we meet and then eventually have to part with because the characters choose to, or because something awful actually happens within the story. When people grieve, they often go through a certain 5 stages. Here's my thesis statement. I believe this story as a whole is a manifestation of those 5 stages of grief. I know what you're thinking. What the f are you on about? Because that is the stupidest ever. End this video right now and get the f out of here, you piece of I think it's better if I just explain it. So let's dive right into the first stage, denial. How does this game represent denial? Well, throughout the story, Joel never mentions his daughter up until the final half of the game.
Is that after you lost Sarah?
Yes, it was.
I can't imagine losing someone you love like that. Losing everything that you know. I'm sorry, Joel.
That's okay, Ellie.
Even when he's handed a picture of her from his brother, he denies it. Even his reluctance to accept the task of taking this young girl he just met can be construed as some form of denial or repressing a terrible loss. He doesn't want to get close to people only to lose them. We see that clearly in the end of the game. So that's the first stage. And again, there is a lot of representation of denial, anger, all these stages that ebb and flow. It's never constant. And the 5 stages of grief are also not constant. People can go through 3 stages or no stages at all. Everyone grieves differently, but I do believe firmly that there is 5 examples here that really represent. So that was my first example. We're moving on to stage number 2, anger. Because I am angry right now. And this one is, again, one that's more ebby and flowy, because Joel is pretty much infused with anger and reluctance throughout this entire story. The best example of him going through this is when Ellie saves him, and instead of thanking her, he sternly tells him she could have killed him. And they kind of get into an argument there.
Act like I told you to.
Well, you're glad I didn't, right?
I'm glad I didn't get my head blown off by a goddamn kid.
You know what? No. How about, hey, Ellie, I know it wasn't easy, but it was either him or me. Thanks for saving my ass. You got anything like that for me, Joel?
We gotta get going.
So again, this is something that's throughout the story, because even when Ellie gets kidnapped by David, we see Joel going on a rampage to get her back. That was true anger. He doesn't want to lose her. Even Ellie is a manifestation of anger here, because she slaughters David at the end of this chapter, and she is just angry and scared. Also, David, he deserves it. That was a decent example, probably not the best one, but it was good enough to kind of show you that anger is something that's going to be just throughout this story, and we're probably going to see even more of it in part 2. But let's move on to the third stage, bargaining. This one was a bit more tricky because I couldn't figure out whether there was going to be a physical form of bargaining manifested within the game, and I did think that when Ellie is introduced to David the first time, she is bargaining for Joel's life by giving up the deer for some medicine to save Joel, and then she eventually gets kidnapped, but that's not actually it. I think bargaining is a little different here. This is a post-apocalyptic world after all. For me, bargaining came when Joel finally made it to the Fireflies to deliver Ellie. He finds out that she has to die for a cure to be made, which is terrible, I know, and you're stuck with this crazy dilemma that thankfully you don't have to answer yourself because it's all baked right into the story. Joel's form of bargaining is quite aggressive. Instead of pleading for a trade or anything, he goes on a rampage to kill every Firefly and make sure Ellie is safe. So he is actually in fact trading the lives of many for just Ellie. Joel is in his right to do this because he wants to save an innocent girl. Anyway, he does go on a rampage and he kills every Firefly just to make sure Ellie is safe. He even kills the lead surgeon just ready to fight you. So once he secures Ellie, he has to run. This is where the game draws that parallel because it's going to start looking familiar. The bargaining worked, he got her back, and he's one elevator trip away from freedom. He is just running and running just like he does in the beginning, holding his daughter in his hands. You see soldiers running behind him, shooting at him, and then you make it to the elevator. You run into Marlene, who is the final bargaining chip, the final soldier that he ran into when he lost his daughter. She tells him,
that is, if she hasn't been raped and murdered first.
It ain't for you to decide.
It's what she'd want. And you know it. Look. You can still do the right thing here. She won't feel anything.
and then he kills her. Joel's form of bargaining is vicious. He learned from the beginning of the game 20 years ago that you can't do this a right way. You have to kill those that want to stop you. So he bargains to save that one life for 1,000. Okay, so there's the bargaining stage. It's a bit crazy, but I do believe that's it, because bargaining can be represented in different ways, whether it's fighting to get what you need back, and this I think is a perfect representation of that. But let's move on to the penultimate stage, depression. after hearing the bad news about the Fireflies not being there. And we're playing as Ellie and we were following Joel to get back to the camp where we met Joel's brother Tommy. Ellie is quiet, she's not talking, she's very much to herself. And we've seen this before with Ellie. After she kills David, she is quiet and to herself, but then they see those beautiful giraffes. And that is where things kind of go back to normal for those two. Seeing that beauty in nature just revived her. But there is no beauty in nature here. She's quiet and she's depressed. She is questioning everything and she is reluctant to speak. But when she finally does, we make it to the final stage, acceptance.
You keep finding something to fight for. Now, I know that's not what you want to hear right now.
Swear to me. Swear to me that everything that you've said about the Fireflies is true.
I swear.
Okay.
Ellie accepts his truth. As far as we know, that was acceptance. That was two sides of acceptance. That was acceptance that Joel finally found someone that he loves again, and Ellie, who may or may not believe him, we still don't know, but it looked like she did, and we don't know what's gonna happen in the next story unless you read spoilers. Please don't spoil them in my comments. Please, please, please. Anyway, as I said, I did plan to do a review for this game, but something seemed off about doing that. Instead, I wanted to tell you about my major takeaways after replaying this for a fourth time. I am excited to see where this story goes, and I'm excited to see Ellie finally close this chapter of one of the most harrowing stories I've ever experienced in video games. Except for that one other game I played.
Get glitched.
Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, hit me with a like, and if you like any other of my videos, maybe go ahead and just f***ing annihilate that subscribe button, you know, just beat the fuck out of it, you know? I will be talking about The Last of Us Part 2 once it drops and I get to play it, so be on the lookout for that follow-up video to this one. Until then, I'll see you next Monday.